Marcus Henderson sat in his leather chair, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office on the 42nd floor. The city sprawled beneath him like a chessboard, with tiny people moving like ants through the streets. He owned half of those buildings down there, but, today, none of it mattered. His empire of hotels, restaurants, and real estate developments felt meaningless when he looked at the small photograph on his desk. 7-year-old Emma smiled back at him from the silver frame, her missing front teeth making her grin even more precious. She had her mother's eyes, bright blue like summer skies, but everything else was purely Marcus. The stubborn chin, the way she wrinkled her nose when concentrating, even her habit of humming while drawing pictures. "Mr. Henderson?" His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your meeting with the board starts in 10 minutes. Marcus rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Cancel it, Sarah. Move everything to tomorrow." "Sir?" "But, the quarterly reports, tomorrow, Sarah." His voice was firm but tired. "I need to go home." The drive to his mansion in the hills usually calmed him, but today the silence in his Bentley felt oppressive. He thought about Emma, probably sitting with Mrs. Patterson, the elderly nanny he'd hired 6 months ago. She was kind and professional, but Emma needed more than kindness. She needed a mother's love, something Marcus couldn't give her no matter how hard he tried. The mansion's gates opened automatically as his car approached. The security guard waved from his booth, and Marcus managed a weak smile in return. Everything about his life was automatic, controlled, perfect on the surface. But inside these walls lived a little girl who cried herself to sleep some nights, asking why other kids had mommies and she didn't. "Daddy!" Emma's voice echoed through the marble foyer as Marcus entered. She came running down the grand staircase, her school uniform slightly wrinkled, backpack bouncing against her small frame. Marcus knelt down and caught her in a fierce hug, breathing in the smell of her strawberry shampoo. For a moment, the weight lifted from his chest. "How was school, princess?" "We made Mother's Day cards today." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus felt his heart clench. "I made one anyway. Mrs. Patterson said I could give it to you." Mrs. Patterson appeared at the top of the stairs, her gray hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. She gave Marcus a meaningful look that said they needed to talk later. Emma skipped toward the kitchen, chattering about her friend Jessica's new puppy. "She's been asking more questions," Mrs. Patterson said quietly once Emma was out of earshot. "About her mother, about why she doesn't have one like the other children." "I try to answer as best I can, but..." Marcus nodded, running a hand through his dark hair. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing." The truth was, Marcus had been thinking about it for months. Emma was growing up, becoming more aware of what she was missing. She was starting to notice that all her friends had mothers who picked them up from school, who braided their hair, who kissed their scraped knees. Mrs. Patterson was wonderful, but she was a nanny, not a mother. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus stood in her doorway watching her sleep. Her small form was curled under a pink comforter covered in unicorns, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant he'd brought her from a business trip to Thailand. On her nightstand sat the Mother's Day card she'd made, decorated with glittery hearts and stick figures of her and Marcus holding hands. He thought about his late wife, Catherine, who had died in a car accident when Emma was just 2 years old. Catherine would have known exactly how to handle this. She would have made everything better with her warm laugh and gentle wisdom. But Catherine was gone, and Marcus was left trying to be both mother and father to a little girl who deserved so much more. The next morning brought another crisis. Marcus was reviewing contracts when his phone rang. It was Emma's school. "Mr. Henderson? This is Principal Morrison. I'm afraid Emma had a bit of an incident today." Marcus's stomach dropped. "Is she hurt?" No, she's physically fine. But she got into a fight with another student. Apparently, the child made some unkind comments about Emma not having a mother, and Emma, well, she pushed him down." Marcus closed his eyes. "I'll be right there." The drive to Westfield Academy felt longer than usual. Emma attended one of the most prestigious private schools in the city, where the other children came from wealthy families with perfect lives. At least, they looked perfect from the outside. Marcus was beginning to understand that sometimes looking perfect wasn't enough. He found Emma sitting in the principal's office, her small frame dwarfed by the large leather chair. Her eyes were red from crying, but her chin was set in that stubborn way that reminded Marcus so much of himself. "Hi, Daddy," she said in a small voice. Principal Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s, explained what had happened. Tommy Richardson, whose father owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, had been teasing Emma about being different because she didn't have a mother. The teasing had escalated until Emma finally snapped and pushed the boy. "I understand Emma's frustration," Principal Morrison said carefully. "But we have a zero-tolerance policy for physical aggression." Marcus listened to the lecture about proper conflict resolution and appropriate behavior, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Emma's small hand in his, about the way she tried so hard to be brave, about how she shouldn't have to defend herself against cruel children who didn't understand loss. On the drive home, Emma was unusually quiet. Finally, as they pulled into their driveway, she spoke up. "Daddy, why don't I have a mommy like everyone else?" Marcus turned in his seat to face her. Her blue eyes were wide and serious, waiting for an answer that would make sense of her world. How could he explain that sometimes life took away the people we loved most? How could he tell a 7-year-old that fairness was a myth? "Sometimes life is complicated, Princess," he said finally. "Your mommy loved you very much, but she had to go to heaven before you were old enough to remember her." "But why can't I get a new mommy?" "Jessica's daddy married her stepmom last year, and now she has 2 moms. That's not fair that she gets 2 and I don't get any." The simplicity of her logic was heartbreaking. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and moved to sit beside her in the back seat. "Would you like a new mommy, Emma?" She nodded eagerly. "Yes. And I want her to be nice and funny and make good cookies. Jessica's stepmom makes cookies shaped like animals." That night, after Emma was asleep, Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives. He couldn't continue letting his daughter feel incomplete, wondering why she was different from other children. She needed a mother, someone who would love her unconditionally and be there for all the moments Marcus was missing while building his empire. But finding the right woman wouldn't be simple. Marcus had learned the hard way that his wealth attracted the wrong kind of attention. He'd dated several women over the past few years, but they were all more interested in his bank account than his daughter. They saw Emma as an obstacle to overcome, not a treasure to cherish. He thought about the women in his social circle, the daughters of other wealthy families, the socialites who attended charity galas and country club events. They were beautiful, educated, accomplished, and completely wrong for what he needed. They lived in the same artificial world he did, where image mattered more than substance. What Emma needed was someone real, someone who understood struggle and hardship, someone who would love her for who she was rather than what she represented. Marcus needed to find a woman who would see past his wealth and status to the man underneath, someone who would choose them for the right reasons. An idea began forming in his mind, crazy and impractical but somehow perfect. What if he could meet women without them knowing who he really was? What if he could present himself as just a regular single father looking for love? The plan took shape over several sleepless nights. He would create a new identity, a simple working man with a daughter who needed a mother. He would find a job in a place where real people worked, where women weren't impressed by designer suits and luxury cars. Somewhere he could be judged on his character rather than his portfolio. The decision terrified and excited him in equal measure. Marcus Henderson, billionaire businessman, would disappear for a while. In his place would be Mark Harris, a man looking for something money couldn't buy, genuine love for himself and his daughter. He spent the next week putting his plan into motion. He arranged for his most trusted executives to handle day-to-day operations, telling them he was taking an extended sabbatical to focus on Emma's needs. He found a small apartment across town, furnished it modestly but comfortably. He bought simple clothes, traded his luxury watch for a basic timepiece, and practiced being someone else. The hardest part was explaining the change to Emma without revealing the whole truth. He told her they were going on an adventure, that they would be living somewhere different for a while. Her eyes lit up with excitement, and Marcus realized she craved adventure as much as stability. "Will we still go to my school?" she asked. "You'll go to a new school, princess. You'll make new friends. And maybe find a new mommy?" Marcus smiled, his heart full of hope and determination. "Maybe, Emma. Maybe we will." As he looked around his mansion one last time before their temporary departure, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for an uncertain future. He was about to embark on the most important business venture of his life, one where success wouldn't be measured in profits but in the happiness of a little girl who deserved the world. The next morning, Marcus Henderson ceased to exist. In his place stood Mark Harris, single father and soon-to-be restaurant worker, ready to find the love his daughter needed and perhaps discover something he hadn't known he was missing. The billionaire had become a commoner, and the real adventure was just beginning. As they drove away from the mansion in a modest used car Marcus had purchased for their new life, Emma pressed her face against the window, watching the familiar world disappear behind them. She was excited about their adventure, innocent to the magnitude of what her father was sacrificing for her happiness. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror and smiled. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges or discoveries awaited them, he knew he was making the right choice. His daughter deserved a mother who would love her completely, and he was willing to give up everything to find that woman. The hunt for Emma's new mother was about to begin, and Marcus had never been more determined to succeed at anything in his life. The apartment Mark Harris had rented was a world away from the Henderson mansion. Located in a working-class neighborhood called Riverside, it was a modest two-bedroom unit above a bakery. The smell of fresh bread drifted up through the floors each morning, and Emma declared it was like living in a fairy tale. "Daddy, look." Emma pressed her nose against the small kitchen window, watching children play in the courtyard below. "There are kids everywhere, and they don't wear uniforms." Mark smiled, adjusting his new persona like an uncomfortable jacket. He'd traded his $1,000 suits for jeans and simple button-down shirts. His expensive watch was replaced with a $20 digital one from the drugstore. Even his posture had changed, he walked differently now, less commanding, more approachable. The elementary school Emma would attend was called Riverside Elementary, a brick building with colorful murals painted on the walls and a playground full of laughter. It was nothing like the pristine halls of Westfield Academy, but Emma seemed enchanted by its warmth and energy. "Mr. Harris?" The principal, Mrs. Chen, was a kind woman in her 40s with laugh lines around her eyes. "Emma seems like a delightful child. We're happy to have her join our school family." As they filled out enrollment forms, Mark was careful with his story. He was a recently widowed father who worked in restaurant management. They'd moved to the neighborhood for a fresh start. It was close enough to the truth that he didn't stumble over details, but far enough from reality that no one would connect him to Marcus Henderson, billionaire. The job search was more challenging than Mark had anticipated. He'd never actually applied for a regular job before, his entire adult life had been spent building and running his empire. Sitting in waiting rooms, filling out applications, and interviewing with managers was humbling in ways he hadn't expected. Finally, he found an opportunity at Rosie's Diner, a family-owned restaurant that had been serving the Riverside neighborhood for 30 years. The owner, Frank Rossetti, was a gruff man in his 60s with calloused hands and a direct manner that reminded Mark of his own father. "You ever worked in a kitchen before?" Frank asked, looking over Mark's carefully crafted resume. "Some," Mark lied smoothly. "But I'm a fast learner and hard worker." Frank studied him for a moment. "You talk fancy for someone looking for kitchen work. You running from something?" "Just trying to build a better life for my daughter," Mark said, and that at least was completely true. Frank's expression softened slightly. "Single dad, huh? That's tough. Kitchen work is hard, hot, fast, demanding. You sure you want this?" "I need this," Mark replied, putting as much sincerity as he could into his voice. "All right, Harris. You start Monday. 6 in the morning, prep work. Don't be late." That evening, Mark sat in their small living room watching Emma color while cartoons played on their modest television. She seemed happier than she'd been in months, excited about starting a new school and making new friends. But Mark was terrified. Tomorrow he would begin working in a kitchen, something he'd never done in his life. His hands, which had signed billion-dollar deals, would be chopping vegetables and washing dishes. Monday morning came too quickly. Mark arrived at Rosie's diner at 5:50, determined to make a good impression. The early morning air was crisp, and the neighborhood was just waking up. A few regulars were already waiting outside the diner, coffee cups in hand, reading newspapers. The kitchen was smaller than Mark had expected, barely large enough for the industrial stove, prep stations, and massive refrigerator. The morning crew was already at work: Carlos, the head cook, a stocky man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, Jimmy, a younger guy who worked the grill, and Diana, a woman in her 30s who seemed to run the front of house with military precision. "You must be the new guy," Carlos said, not looking up from the onions he was dicing with impressive speed. "Frank said you're starting on prep. Ever use one of these?" He held up a large knife that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Sure," Mark lied, accepting the knife gingerly. Carlos watched him attempt to chop a carrot and immediately shook his head. "No, no, no. You're going to cut yourself. Here, watch." He demonstrated the proper technique, his hands moving in a fluid rhythm that spoke of years of practice. The first day was brutal. Mark's back ached from standing for hours, his hands were covered in small cuts despite Carlos's patient instruction, and, by lunch rush, he was completely overwhelmed. The kitchen moved like a choreographed dance, and he was the only one out of step. "Don't worry," Diana said during a brief break, handing him a cup of coffee. "Everyone struggles the first week. Carlos had to rebuild my knife skills from scratch when I started working back here." "You worked in the kitchen?" "2 years ago, when my ex-husband left me with 2 kids and a mountain of debt. Frank let me work back here until a waitressing position opened up. Better tips in front." She studied his face with intelligent brown eyes. "You don't look like most guys who end up here. What's your story?" Mark was saved from answering by the lunch rush bell. The next few hours passed in a blur of orders, chopping, and trying not to get in anyone's way. By closing time, he could barely stand, but he'd made it through his first day. Emma was waiting for him at their neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment, where she stayed after school until he got home. She bounded toward him with stories about her new teacher and the friend she'd made named Katie. "Daddy, you smell like food," she said, wrinkling her nose. "That's because Daddy worked in a kitchen today," he explained, settling onto their small couch with a groan. "Are you going to cook for me now?" Emma's eyes lit up with possibility. Mark laughed, remembering his disastrous attempts at following simple prep instructions. "I think we'll stick with Mrs. Rodriguez's cooking for now, princess." The days blended together as Mark slowly found his rhythm at the diner. His knife skills improved, his movements became more confident, and gradually the team began accepting him as one of their own. He learned that Carlos sent money back to family in Mexico, that Jimmy was saving up for community college, and that Diana was studying to become a nurse while raising her 2 children alone. It was a world unlike anything Marcus Henderson had ever known. These people worked hard for every dollar, struggled to make ends meet, and supported each other through difficulties that would have seemed insurmountable in his previous life. There was a dignity in their work, a pride in doing their jobs well despite the modest pay and long hours. 3 weeks into his new life, Mark was working the early prep shift when she walked in. Her name was Keisha Johnson, and she was applying for the evening waitress position that had just opened up. She was maybe 28, with natural hair pulled back in an elegant twist and skin like polished bronze. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with a confidence that immediately caught Mark's attention. "I'm here about the waitressing job," she told Diana, who was handling interviews since Frank was at the doctor. "Have you waited tables before?" Diana asked, leading her to a corner booth. "For years at Marco's downtown, and 2 years at a family place before that. I have references." Keisha's voice was warm and professional, with just a hint of nervousness that suggested she really needed this job. Mark tried to focus on his prep work, but found himself stealing glances at the interview. Keisha answered questions thoughtfully, laughed at Diana's jokes, and, when a customer's child started crying at a nearby table, she naturally moved to help calm the baby while the mother searched for a bottle. "Why are you leaving your current job?" Diana asked. "Marco's is closing next month. The owner is retiring. I need steady work, I have a daughter to support." Keisha's expression was determined but vulnerable, and Mark felt something shift in his chest. "Tell me about your daughter." Keisha's face lit up with unmistakable love. "She's 6, in first grade. Her name is Zoe, and she's the smartest, funniest little girl in the world. She wants to be a veterinarian because she thinks all animals should be happy and healthy." She pulled out her phone to show Diana a picture, and, even from across the room, Mark could see the pride in her smile. "Being a single mom and working nights is tough," Diana observed. "It is, but Zoe is worth everything. My neighbor Mrs. Williams watches her when I work evenings, and Zoe knows I'm doing this all for our future. She's very understanding for a 6-year-old. Diana hired her on the spot." That evening, Mark watched Keisha work her first shift. She moved efficiently between tables, remembered orders without writing them down, and had a natural warmth that made customers smile. When an elderly man dining alone seemed lonely, she spent an extra moment chatting with him about his late wife's favorite dessert. When a family with young children struggled with a spilled drink, she cleaned it up without making them feel embarrassed. "She's good," Carlos commented, watching Keisha serve a table of construction workers who were clearly charmed by her easy banter. "Natural talent," Diana agreed. "Plus she actually needs this job. Makes a difference." Mark found himself creating reasons to work near the pass-through window where he could observe Keisha throughout the evening. She handled difficult customers with grace, helped new servers learn the routine, and never seemed to lose her composure even during the busiest dinner rush. At the end of her shift, as she was counting her tips, Mark worked up the courage to introduce himself properly. "I'm Mark Harris," he said, approaching her table. "I work prep and sometimes help with cooking. Keisha Johnson. Nice to meet you properly." Her smile was genuine and reached her eyes. "Diana mentioned you're new too. How are you settling in?" "Still learning, but everyone's been patient with me." He gestured toward the empty seat across from her. "Mind if I sit?" "I wanted to ask, Diana mentioned you have a daughter." "Mine just started at Riverside Elementary." Keisha's expression brightened. "Really? Zoe's in first grade there. What grade is your daughter in?" "Second grade. Emma. She's been talking about a girl named Zoe in the grade below her. Small world. Very small. Zoe mentioned an Emma who helped her find the bathroom on her first day. She said Emma was super nice and has the prettiest hair." Keisha laughed, and the sound made something warm unfold in Mark's chest. They talked for another 20 minutes, sharing stories about their daughters, the challenges of single parenthood, and the adjustment to working at the diner. Mark found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years, just enjoying conversation with a woman who saw him as Mark Harris, kitchen worker and single dad, rather than Marcus Henderson, business mogul. "I should go," Keisha said finally, gathering her purse. "Mrs. Williams charges extra if I'm late, and I can't afford to lose her as a babysitter." "Of course. Maybe, would you like to grab coffee sometime? I mean, if you're not too busy." "I know single parent schedules are crazy." Keisha hesitated, studying his face. "Coffee sounds nice. But, I should mention, I don't date much. Zoe comes first, always." "Emma comes first for me too," Mark said quietly. "I think that's something we understand about each other." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "Coffee sounds very nice, Mark Harris." As Mark walked home that night, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Catherine died: hope. Not the desperate hope of a man trying to find his daughter a mother, but something deeper and more personal. For the first time in years, he was interested in a woman for himself, not just for what she might bring to Emma's life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He created this elaborate charade to find genuine connection, and now he was terrified that the very deception that had made it possible might destroy it. Keisha was falling for Mark Harris, a man who didn't really exist. The question was, could she ever love Marcus Henderson, and everything that identity entailed? But that was a problem for another day. Tonight, he had a coffee date to look forward to, and, for the first time since starting this masquerade, Mark Harris felt more real than Marcus Henderson ever had. The coffee date was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at a small cafe called Billionaire, a cozy spot 3 blocks from the diner. Mark arrived 10 minutes early, his palms sweating like he was 16 again. He'd chosen his outfit carefully: dark jeans, a simple blue sweater, and his worn leather jacket. Nothing that would suggest he owned suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Keisha arrived right on time, wearing a flowing yellow dress that made her skin glow and her smile even more radiant. She'd left her hair down, and it framed her face in soft curls that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the cafe windows. "I almost didn't come," she admitted as they settled into a corner booth. "I kept thinking of reasons why this was a bad idea." "Such as?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice light despite the anxiety that immediately spiked in his chest. "Well, we work together, for one. That can get complicated. And I don't really know anything about you beyond the fact that you're new to kitchen work and have a daughter." She stirred sugar into her coffee, considering. "For all I know, you could be a serial killer." Mark nearly choked on his coffee. "I can assure you, I'm not a serial killer." "That's exactly what a serial killer would say," Keisha replied with a grin that let him know she was teasing. "Fair point. What would convince you I'm harmless? Tell me about yourself. Real things, not just the basics. What were you doing before the diner? What made you move to Riverside? What's your story, Mark Harris?" The questions hit like a series of punches. Mark had prepared for this moment, rehearsed his cover story until it felt natural, but, sitting across from Keisha, looking into her honest brown eyes, the lies felt heavy on his tongue. "I worked in restaurant management," he began, sticking to his script. "Corporate stuff, mostly. When my wife died, I realized I was spending too much time focused on work and not enough time with Emma. The move to Riverside was about simplifying our lives, being more present for each other." It wasn't entirely false. He had been too focused on work, and Emma did need more of his attention. But the omissions felt like deceptions, and Mark found himself talking faster, eager to move away from dangerous territory. "What about you? You mentioned Marco's was closing. Have you always lived in Riverside?" "Born and raised," Keisha said. "My grandmother lived 6 blocks from where I live now. This neighborhood raised me." Her expression grew more serious. "Zoe's father left when she was 2. He said he wasn't ready to be a parent, wasn't ready for responsibility. I haven't heard from him since. I'm sorry. That must have been incredibly difficult." It was. But, honestly, we're better off without him. Zoe deserves someone who chooses to be in her life every single day, not someone who sees her as a burden. Keisha's voice carried a strength that impressed Mark. "I'd rather raise her alone than let her think she's not worth fighting for." Mark thought about his own commitment to Emma, the lengths he was going to find her a mother who would truly love her. "She's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one. Zoe is." Keisha's face lit up with the same pride Mark felt when talking about Emma. "She's remarkable. Funny and smart and kind. She cries when she sees homeless people and wants to bring them all home. Last week she spent her allowance on cat food for the stray cats behind our building. Emma does things like that too. She once insisted we buy groceries for an elderly neighbor because she noticed the woman was eating the same can of soup every day. Single parents raising empathetic children," Keisha observed. "We must be doing something right." They talked for 2 hours, the conversation flowing easily from their daughters to books to music to dreams. Mark discovered that Keisha was studying to become a teacher through online courses, working toward a degree she'd started years ago but had to postpone when Zoe was born. She loved old movies, especially musicals from the 1950s. She volunteered at a food bank every other Sunday, bringing Zoe along to teach her about helping others. "What about you?" Keisha asked. "What do you do for fun when you're not working or parenting?" Mark realized with a start that he didn't know how to answer. Marcus Henderson's hobbies included sailing, golf at exclusive country clubs, and attending charity galas that were really networking events. Mark Harris needed different interests, more modest pursuits. "I like to read," he said, which was true. "History, mostly. And I've been teaching myself guitar from YouTube videos." That was a complete fabrication, but it sounded believable. "Guitar? That's wonderful. Zoe's been asking about music lessons, but they're expensive." Mark made a mental note. If things progressed between them, he could easily arrange for Zoe to have the best music teachers money could buy. But Mark Harris couldn't make that offer. "Maybe when I get better, I could teach her some basics," he suggested instead. As they prepared to leave, Keisha hesitated by the door. "This was nice, Mark. Really nice. But I want to be clear about something." Mark's stomach tightened. "What's that?" "I don't do casual dating. I can't. Zoe gets attached to people, and I won't introduce her to someone who might just disappear. If we're going to see each other, it needs to be because you're genuinely interested in building something real." The irony was devastating. She was asking for honesty and commitment from a man whose entire identity was a lie. Mark looked into her eyes and saw the protection instinct of a mother who had been hurt before, who was determined not to let her daughter experience that same abandonment. "I understand completely," he said quietly. "I feel the same way about Emma. She's been through enough." "Then, we're on the same page." Keisha smiled, but it was careful, guarded. "I'd like to see you again, but slowly. Maybe we could take the girls to the park next weekend? Let them meet properly? I'd like that very much." That evening, Mark sat in his modest apartment, staring at the phone number Keisha had given him. Emma was asleep in her room, exhausted from a day spent playing with neighborhood children in ways she'd never been allowed at their mansion. She was adapting to their new life with the resilience of childhood, making friends and embracing adventure. But Mark was wrestling with guilt that threatened to consume him. He was falling for Keisha, really falling, in a way that had nothing to do with finding Emma a mother and everything to do with the way Keisha made him laugh, the way she challenged him, the way she looked at him like he was just a regular man worth knowing. The problem was that Mark Harris was temporary. Eventually, he would have to return to being Marcus Henderson. His business empire couldn't run indefinitely without his direct involvement. His fortune carried responsibilities he couldn't abandon forever. And, when that time came, what would happen to Keisha? To Zoe? To Emma, who was finally starting to heal. He picked up his phone and called his assistant, Sarah. "Mr. Henderson? Is everything all right? You haven't returned my calls." "Everything's fine, Sarah. How are things at the office?" "Manageable, but several deals are waiting for your approval. The Tokyo project needs your signature by Friday, and the board is asking when you'll be back for the quarterly review." "Stall them another week," Mark said. "Tell them I'm handling family matters." "Sir, with respect, you've been gone almost a month. People are starting to ask questions." Mark closed his eyes. A month. It felt like a lifetime and an instant simultaneously. "One more week, Sarah. That's all I need." But, even as he said it, Mark knew he was lying to himself as much as to everyone else. One more week wouldn't be enough. He was beginning to understand that no amount of time would be sufficient to resolve the impossible situation he'd created. The next morning at the diner, Mark found himself watching Keisha with new intensity. She moved through her shift with efficient grace, building relationships with regular customers, helping train a new server, handling a complaint from a difficult patron without losing her composure. She was everything Marcus Henderson had convinced himself didn't exist in his world: genuine, hardworking, unimpressed by superficial things. During a brief break, she approached his prep station. I've been thinking about yesterday, she said quietly, checking to make sure Diana wasn't within earshot. Mark's heart rate spiked. Good thoughts, I hope? Mostly. Keisha leaned against the counter, close enough that he caught her scent, something warm and vanilla that made him think of comfort and home. I realized I don't know some basic things about you. Like where you lived before here, what Emma's school was like, why you really left restaurant management. What do you mean, why I really left? Mark tried to keep his voice casual while his mind raced. You're good at this work, but it's not natural for you. Your knife skills are improving, but you hold yourself like someone who's used to giving orders, not taking them. And, Emma. Keisha paused, choosing her words carefully. She talks differently than most kids from this neighborhood. More formal, like she's been around adults a lot. Mark's blood turned to ice. He'd been so focused on creating a believable backstory for himself that he hadn't coached Emma on changing her speech patterns or mannerisms. Of course Keisha, as a mother and someone working toward teaching, would notice things others missed. Emma went to a pretty good private school before we moved, Mark said carefully. She picked up some habits there. Must have been expensive. Her mother left some life insurance money. I wanted to give Emma the best education I could afford. The lie came easier this time, perhaps because it contained kernels of truth about wanting the best for his daughter. Keisha studied his face for a long moment, and Mark felt like she was seeing more.